All right, students, welcome to part 2 of the lectures I'm giving on topic 1.6 on developments in Europe, 1200 to 1450 CE. This lecture will very much touch on all aspects of these learning objectives, but I'm especially trying to focus on sort of the idea of economic recovery and how that sets Europe up to climb out of this period that it's sometimes known as the Dark Ages and into a more prosperous period, a more unified period with stronger, more effective rulers and kingdoms. So let's get into it. Following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476, an era known as the Dark Ages kind of swept over Europe and remained for centuries. And this Dark Age is characterized by a significant decline of population and urban centers, and also of the trade that went along with those urban centers. Trade was reduced to just a trickle. It was still coming in through Venice or Genoa, through Byzantium and Spain, but it was a mere fraction of what had existed under the Roman Empire, and instead had been replaced by the manorial system, which you learned about in a previous lecture. But was based, the manorial system essentially refers to the self-sufficient communities that developed in response to this lack of trade goods, right? The domains of the counts and dukes and nobles of Europe and the farmlands on which they lived along with their peasants replaced this system of sort of interregional trade, and every community became self-sufficient. However, as the years of the Middle Ages progressed, commerce began to grow once more, and new trade routes were established that were helped along by several important developments. Starting with Venice and the Crusades and this idea of Pax Mongolica, Venice and several other Italian city-states, such as Genoa or Bari, prospered as a kind of, middlemen of the Mediterranean, connecting the Eastern world with Western Europe. Especially Venice and Genoa, who traded heavily with Byzantium and the Islamic states of North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, the Holy Land or the Levant. The Crusades, for example, are sometimes also credited with helping this growth in trade, as crusaders from Western Europe traveled to the Islamic world and grew to desire the many luxury goods that they encountered there. The use of Venice as a transport fleet during the Fourth Crusade also helped Venice to control one of the largest navies in Europe from that point onward, as well, if you remember what happens during the Fourth Crusade, as knocking out one of their rival competitors, the city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. After the Mongols conquered much of Eurasia in the 1200s and 1300s, they ushered in an era of relative peace and stability known as the Pax Mongolica, which increased the flow of goods along the Silk Roads and further grew the economies and flow of currency between East Asia and Western Europe. So trade was slowly stimulated within Europe from outside and within Europe as well, as merchants selling wool, weapons and armor, manufactured goods like furniture or clothing, wine and beer, etc., converged from the northern and southern cities at the fairs and markets that traveled from city to city throughout the year. The most famous of these trade fairs was one that was regularly held in Champagne, France. The growth of these fairs and the trade that they brought helped cities in the Middle Ages to grow as well. Cities in the Middle Ages sometimes could operate outside of the feudal system and often held charters from local lords and kings that permitted them to conduct their business sort of independently and to have their city dwellers exempt from some of the labor demands of feudalism, right? They didn't have to go chop wood or shovel manure for their landlords. They sort of lived on these, independent charters that their cities were founded on. Europe had seen a decline in urban centers, as we said, after the fall of Rome, but by the later part of the Middle Ages, urban centers began to grow once more. Many of these new communities grew out of those smaller communities that had formed around monasteries and castles built during the early parts of the Middle Ages. The growth of cities and trade gave birth to a new middle class of city dwellers known as burghers, because they lived in the burgs, like Strasbourg or Hamburg or Freiburg, right? German cities. The members of this social class were the shopkeepers, the merchants, the craftsmen, the small landowners. They held a status that was more tied to economics than Christian ideals or the military might of feudalism. So social mobility was more possible in this economic setting, although there were still many social obstacles to the advancements of members of this new class that we'll discuss in later modules. Jews, Christians, and usury. The medieval Catholic Church had a policy that forbade Christians from charging interest on loans. This kind of money-making was seen as an unchristian exploitation of the circumstances of poverty. Usury is a word that is usually used to refer to the practice of charging interest on loans, especially high interest. And the Jewish faith had no restrictions on charging non-Jews interest for the Jews that lived in Europe, mostly in Spain or Portugal, but more and more they were moving into Northern Europe. This left room for them to work as bankers and moneylenders, an economic service that helped increase the flow of cash and currency around Europe and helped to progress Europe from a feudal, land and agriculture-based economy to a money and market-based economy. During and just before the time of the Renaissance, Italian families such as the Medici family began to establish banks of their own as well and continue to increase the supply of currency for the rulers and feudal lords of Europe. In general, though, anti-Semitism grew throughout the Middle Ages, and Jews were often targeted by their neighbors of their communities. England, for example, expelled all their Jews in 1290. France in 1394. Spain in 1492 expelled all Jews and Muslims that would not convert to Christianity in Portugal. And Portugal expelled their Jews in 1497. All of these expulsions were preceded by violent persecution known as pogroms, such as the many attacks against Jews in the Holy Roman Empire in cities such as Strasbourg during the time of the plague. So agriculture, serfs, and the plague, all right? Population grew during the High Middle Ages as invasions of Vikings, Magyars, and Arabs ended, and improvements were made in food production. More production encouraged the growth of towns which were more easily supported by this greater surplus, and markets that could meet more often due to that greater surplus. The three-field system, one of the major achievements in agriculture in medieval Europe that lends itself to this prosperity, was the three-field system. This was a simple yet revolutionary advancement to the crop rotation system. The Romans, and earlier civilizations even, throughout the world had practiced crop rotation, where your farm is divided into two fields, one for that season's crop and the other to be left unplanted, or fallow, as it's called, to allow the soil a chance to recover nutrients. In the Middle Ages, farmers began to split their fields into thirds, where 1/3 would be, maybe spring crops, 1/3 would be sort of winter crops or maybe a rest crop that would allow the soil to also sort of replenish. Certain beans, like soybeans, add nitrogen to the soil. But either way, usually one crop you could harvest at one time of the year, another crop you would harvest at another time of the year, and then 1/3 of your field left fallow or unplanted. This meant that at any given time, farmers were using more like 66% of their farm instead of just 50% at a time. This also made people less vulnerable to famine, as one bad season didn't necessarily ruin the whole year because you were planting two different seasons of crops. Two bad seasons, though, and you would be in trouble. Better technology also accompanies this sort of growth in agricultural productivity. Heavier plows that were made of iron and steel and could cut deeper into the soil, as well as horse collars that kind of transferred where the horse was pulling from, right? This horse collar now had horses pulling from their shoulders and chest instead of from the neck, where a horse would kind of strangle itself a little bit as it tried to pull on these plows. Furthermore, Oxen were replaced by horses because horses are better than oxen, I guess. They're stronger and can work on these plows for longer. Windmills also trickled in from the Middle East with other technologies like gunpowder. So throughout this growth of trade, one of the major sort of trade areas that was formed was known as the Hanseatic League. This was basically a commercial alliance between a bunch of Scandinavian and northern German towns like Lübeck or Riga or Hamburg. And they controlled trade in the North and Baltic seas and used the allied fleets of their cities to clear the area of pirates. They monopolized the trade of certain goods like timber, grain, salted fish in that area, and made long expeditions along the Atlantic coast of Europe into the Mediterranean to trade with Muslims in southern European cities such as Venice or Genoa. Eventually, the Hanseatic League would come to an end in the 1600s or the 17th century when the nations of that time were strong enough to provide protection to their own merchants, and this league no longer needed to fill that role. Finally, medieval guilds, all right? Medieval guilds also contributed to this economic expansion of the Middle Ages by their very existence, right? Guilds are associations of craftspeople that originated in the medieval towns. Different occupations worked in separate guilds, right? A weaver's guild, a carpenter's guild, a clockmaker's guild, etc. And these guilds regulated the rules for apprenticeships, how long a worker should apprentice themselves to a master, what level of skill that person should achieve before they were allowed to practice that trade on their own. And they helped the families of the injured or killed workers. They controlled the quality of products that were produced. They acted in a lot of ways something like a modern workers' union in the help and training and support that they provided their members, but also in the trouble that they made for non-members, non-guild members, trying to practice their trade in a guild-run city. These guilds could use their economic power also to apply pressure to local lords and to monarchs, further strengthening the power of cities. But either way, guilds were essential in just the general improvement to the quality of craftsmen and manufactured goods in Europe that allowed trade to grow and prosper throughout the Middle Ages and reconnect them once more with the outside world. All right, that concludes this lecture on the sort of economic recovery of Europe in the Middle Ages. I hope that helped. I hope you're able to make a lot of connections to your learning objectives. Talk to you guys again soon. Thanks a lot.